And we're live. Well, welcome everybody to another Real Talk with Rob Tavi. Today I have Dennis Reed, Senior Research Analyst from Edgewater Research. They get into electronics is what the Real Talk is all about. And we brought on a research analyst talking about all the data and insights about electronics, the supply chain components, breaking them down, really what's going on in the market. They have great analytics. They set out things monthly, quarterly. They have webinars, and Dennis has done a great job of really enhancing and really sharing that data to the masses to really understand what's going on into the world today and how the future is into electronics. So, welcome, Dennis. Welcome to the Real Talk.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rob, for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I know we've been chatting back and forth, going back in probably this past year, and it's been good. A lot of things happening. A lot of things we can't control, a lot of global issues, a lot of challenges. Monetary policy, a lot of things happening. That's really, from post pandemic now. From that side, now having a lot of other issues coming back. So it's changing a lot the way we play every day, and especially the manufacturing supply chain components.
I couldn't agree more. It's been fascinating on one hand just to look at how dynamic, and Rob, you've been in the business for a while, so it's a pretty dynamic industry any way you cut it. But while I struggle and I'm tired of hearing the word unprecedented, what we've gone through from a supply chain really is unprecedented. And I've given a lot of webinars, speaking engagements, and it's amazing when you run through just a snapshot of all the disruption we've seen. Almost every person I could start and end with, we've been through all of this, but you don't need to out yourself. But I'm willing to bet most people sitting in the audience are sitting at record profits and record sales right now. So, credit to everybody in the supply chain. It's been impressive with all the disruption, how dynamic it is, and the ability that we've shown to bend, but most certainly not break under it.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of adversities, a lot of people call pivots during the COVID, going to home. A lot of things changed in the ecosystems of manufacturing, globalization process. And then also, of course, a lot of the monetary side of spend, of changes in the way we live and work today. A lot of that has to do with how we're driving. Of course, the future is bright. The pandemic has set that fuse of the technology revolution, I would think, in this next decade. But again, we're going to go through some peaks and valleys a lot, because where are we? Where is what's going on in the world? A lot of geopolitics, the challenges, that uncertainties, logistics issues. There's so much out there still with constraints and uncertainties that it's hard to predict the future. But what you guys at Edgewater Research do is help us read the data, take the data in, look at what happened in the past, and kind of formulate what we can do for the future, and calculate a strategy, especially for listeners, right, to understand really what are we trying to do for the future, and what is the data telling us.
It's where we sit right now, and you touched on a lot of it, from geopolitical to monetary policy to demand drivers, and where we sit with all of those factors going. I think the thing that we're discussing internally is kind of the nature of structural changes versus cyclicality in our business, and I think it's prudent to think of those two items right now where we sit. So from a cyclical standpoint, and I'm sure we'll get into this in a little later in the pod, it's clear the best of days are kind of behind this upcycle from just a pure cyclicality. Yes, there's still some key components. There's golden screws, things of that nature, but inventory is far from lean across the supply chain. In near term, demand is ultimately slowing, and we're seeing some of the double bookings and things like that typically show up in cyclical upturns and cyclical downturns. Those are all present. So you've got your cyclical puts and takes here near term, but when you look at the structural demand drivers, whether it's the proliferation of 5G, whether it's industrial 4.0, automotive, whether it's compute and storage with connected devices throughout the world, those structural changes in the business have really ushered us into a new era that has been an accelerated growth environment. I think over the long term, of course, that doesn't mean it's a linear line straight up and to the right, but balancing kind of structural growth versus your cyclicality of the business is kind of where I think we sit in the environment right now.
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree. I mean, to give some of the listeners more insights, I mean, you guys create a lot of, put out a lot of publications or a lot of emails of data and insights. Like, I think you have Electronic Supply Chain Weekly Digest. You sent that out. You have High Performance Analog Supply Chain email. You have Memory Insights. You have Passive Discrete Interconnect Insights. You have Technology Inventory Analysis, like how much finished goods and technology sitting out there. And also, I know you also host quarterly webinars, and looking out in the future, quarter ahead, and looking out to the future. So through these, I mean, all this data collected, can you break some of these down? Really, what is your process? What is Edgewater's process and your process to really aggregate this data? Talk to the stake of the parties of where you get the data from, and then putting it together, formulating it to the customer, to the user, and to the public.
Absolutely. So, the way we view the world, so as a firm, we cover hard tech, so the areas that you mentioned, Rob. So high performance analog, passive discrete, interconnect, CPU, GPU, memory, hard drive. So really the nuts and bolts, if you will, of the technology. We've got a group that focuses predominantly on the consumer space. So we're looking at least 50% of sell through. So we've got a decent end to end. And then layering on top of that, we've got a group that focuses on the digital world. So digital advertising is growing, as a significant portion of the consumer side of the business. Those same people are also growing importance with procurement of the components. So that's where we focus really our products, trying to look end to end. In our process, we take what we call a bottoms up approach. So, yeah, I spend probably 95% of my days on the phone with people like yourself, right? And what we're trying to do in the way we view the world, and it might be a little bit overly simplistic, but if you can figure out bookings, billings, inventory, lead times, and pricing, those kind of handful of building blocks, you've got a decent idea of what's driving this supply chain. So our process being bottoms up, and of course, we don't take an ostrich approach. We're looking top downs, we're looking at GDP growth, we're looking at the macros, things like that. But really, by the time those top down factors inflect, good or bad, it's really too late for our customers' businesses. So by the bottoms up approach and having these conversations, and then on our team layering over 50 years of experience of doing this type of research, there's a little bit of an art and a little bit of a science. And from the science side, it's a repeated process. We've had relationships with these people for decades. So we've been able to somewhat validate, what they see is accurate, through various economic conditions, various market cycles. And then the art is our ability with that experience to say, I've heard this before. This reminds me of XYZ period in the past. While it might not be the same, it gives us a certain foundation as we think about when businesses are going to, either inflect higher or lower.
Yeah, I, it's it hits a couple points there talking about the historical information of what we've seen. We've seen any types of repetitive motion of what we've seen in the past, that we're seeing today, some inflection points like, whoa, how they talk about in the monetary side, like, it comes to a lot of that. Oh, this is the historical that happened the GFC side or the great financial, taking a lot of those data points and saying, are we seeing similar things through the data insights today? Are what is going on today? And using that to really, hey, there could be an alert, there could be a caution, there could be what's going on. And as we all know right now, there are slowdowns. I mean, there are slowdowns, there are inventory buildups. There is a lot of with the monetary fiscal policies of the world, and a lot of the money is not as inflation, and money is not as free as it was anymore because it's costlier. People pull back. A lot of things pull back, a lot of things changes, and those forces also dictate, because at the end of the day, we're consumer spending economy. Consumer industrial, consumer drives it. 'Cause as soon as consumers start driving and start pulling back a little bit, it's going to start affecting the industrial and the infrastructure and all the things that pulled out. So there's kind of a chain reaction, and we've seen the consumer spend this last 6 months, especially
Mhm.
this or the year, last 3 quarters slow down. Because I think the 2 years of pandemic, everybody bought everything they
Yeah.
could, and they're stocked up. So there is a time of gap. But I want to ask from your side, what have you seen? Let's look at 2022 at the
Sure.
first 3 quarters. What have you seen that showed some alerts or some concerns of what's going on in industry, especially and it reflects from the component side, manufacturing, distribution. What do you see on that end?
Sure. So, I think that there's two markets that are the easiest to point out just because it's a pretty clear, transparent unit market, being
Mhm.
PCs and smartphones.
Okay.
And they're also about 50% of silicon consumed globally. So, when we go back to January 1 of this year, last year for PCs, there were 330 million units shipped globally. Prior to COVID, that was a 275 million unit base that was growing 2-3% per year. That obviously accelerated, right? We've had kids at school, kids doing school at home, significant pull forward in demand, and that's really easy to see through the unit shipment. So, there was a mindset in the supply chain on Jan 1 that we're in the new normal, which is another cliche that I'm about tired of hearing with everything. But, we're in a new normal, and PCs are going to grow 10%. So this year should be 365 million, not off the 330 base. Well, here we are 9-10 months in, and the supply chain right now is at about a 295 million unit number for the year. So we've seen, call it 60 to 70 million units being taken out, and drastic order cuts to on the component suppliers. You would think that's enough. The problem is every month demand looks a little slower. First, it was just the consumer, as you referenced. Now we're starting to cycle more in to the enterprise, where you're cycling against a Windows 11 launch last year. You're cycling into, believe it or not, 2 years ago, people showed up to an office and used a desktop. And you had to send them home with a notebook, and understandably. So, we're cycling that, and we've yet to really see a bottom in PCs, which probably will be next year, right at the 275 number. So that incremental growth from the, call it 2021, will come out of the market and will normalize from there. Likewise, little different reasoning behind the smartphone. That's a 1.2-ish billion unit market. This year was going to grow 5%. China's been locked down with their zero COVID strategy. Significant downside to just demand in mainland China in particular. So now we've seen that market go zero, from up 5 to down 5. So again, another, call it 120, 130 million units coming out. So, that's what's gone on from an end demand for the big inflections. Unfortunately, the downside. Now, what does it mean for the markets ultimately that are a little harder to decipher? Your industrials, your automotives, your medicals, these areas. The wafer cut, I shouldn't say, the wafer allocation would be a better way than cuts. Those all started, call it May, June, when really the supply chain fully embraced, we've got a problem in PC, we've got a problem in smartphone. So you've seen wafers being allocated to industrial, to automotive. And that's where, in the near term, that capacity and that shift, there's a cycle time, right? So we're looking 4 or 5 months potentially in an extended supply constrained environment. We're right now, call it 2 to 3 weeks away from where that capacity hits. So, the net of it is, we see it. You've got capacity coming to the markets that has still been constrained, predominantly being auto and industrial. And as I mentioned, these are, from a structural, these are great growth drivers, but they're not going to be able to outrun near-term cyclicality. So you have that capacity coming, and then you're trying to, overlap. How does that play with PMI is dropping globally as a proxy for the industrial economy. Those are all the factors we're looking at. But I think the net of it, when we look into next year, probably more importantly, next year is going to be more cyclical. I still think, broadly for the semi industry as a whole, we entered COVID at a $492 billion annual sales market.
Okay.
We're going to exit this decade at a $1 trillion market, and that's incredible, right? I think if you and I talked on March 15th of 2020, and I said we're going to exit this decade $1 trillion, you would have told me I was crazy. So there's a lot to be excited about, but getting there again goes back to the weighing the cyclicality versus some of the structural growth drivers.
Yeah, I mean, we say as I said, the peaks and valleys. That's cyclical. The cyclical
Yeah,
ups and downs and adversities we're going to get through that growth. Because you hit a lot of very valid points between the consumer side, PC, smartphones, and then now going into some of the industrial enterprise and the automotive. Of course, that is a driver because there's a lot of money now between automotive and EV
absolutely.
infrastructure build. But again, they're cyclical because you can't have consistent double-digit growth year over year. And that's really we had unprecedented growth because of stimulations of financial monetary systems putting money into the economies that kind of caused a lot of that.
Auto is an interesting one to us. So
Yeah.
there's and we could talk cyclical growth for
Yeah.
cyclical peaks and valleys, growth declines for structural. So the structural one's pretty easy to see. I mean, in 2020 there was 1.7 million EVs sold, and that's probably going to be a 50, call it mid 50 million vehicle number by 2040. So in 20 years, significant growth. And your content there is very easy to see. Today you've got $300 or so, $400 worth of content in an internal combustion engine vehicle that's at least 1,500, right? So we're talking one EV is the equivalent of three,
Ice
Ford
cars,
Focuses
ice,
or
as you call
whatever.
them. Yeah, yeah.
So that's your structural growth. That is double digits, by all means.
Yeah.
When you look at the cyclicality of auto, and I'll focus a little bit on global production, but then ultimately just, the SAR or kind of sales numbers here in the US, we're dealing with, I think, what you've seen in PCs and other markets. So, from a production standpoint, the peak global auto production was somewhere 2017-ish, I think, around 95 million units globally were produced. We started Jan 1 of this year, the view was about 87 million units, up from 80 last year, so 9-10% type growth. Due to supply chain component issues, everything else, which are real, we're only going to produce 78 million vehicles globally.
Yeah.
That's a massive delta, right? When all semi suppliers are putting up 20-30% growth.
Correct.
Likewise, when we look at your sales in the US, the SAR peaked, in that same period, I think it was kind of 18-19 million units for the US on a seasonally adjusted basis. And we obviously bottomed out in COVID when the world shut down practically to zero, but we've rebounded back, and we've gotten to this year where Jan 1, we said, oh, this is going to be a 16 million, vehicles sold, and we're looking probably 13.5, 14 million this year. So a gap of 2.5 million. Right now, where we sit, call it October 1st for rounding's sake, everyone's taking that $2.5 million or 2.5 million unit sales and saying, well, this is our backlog. Yep. Next year, that 13 or 14 million SAR, that's going to be 16.5, 17, because we're going to get all of our demand for 23, plus we're going to get caught up. That's where then we look top down, and we don't have a direct answer for this, but that's where my concerns, I would say, come in is it's frankly expensive, right? I haven't, personally gone out to test what the rates are to finance a car, but I've read the articles about financing a home, and I know personally we refied our place, February of this year and locked in a nice 2.9% loan. If we did it now, we'd be staring at 7%,
Yeah,
right?
it's
So how does that transfer through, and does that demand, is that sale ultimately expendable? If you
yeah.
didn't catch it this year, did you lose it? Especially if your only barrier maybe, not making light of a $500 deposit, but let's say it's refundable. Do you really look out and say, can I get another year out of this car
Yeah.
until prices come down? So very, very dynamic. And I would say, cyclical, going back to the cyclical versus structural, the auto structural growths are great. I mean, for those that'll be at ECIA, I'll talk a little bit about some market sizing there at my presentation. The structural side's very exciting over the next decade,
Yeah.
but cyclical, I think, we're going to have to adjust outside of this outsized growth before we return to it.
I mean, getting the EVs are automotive, and we know. I mean, the last years or so, you want to buy a car. There's no cars in the lots. You can't even get a car like it used to be. You have to order them. There's a lot of dealer markups. A lot of people paying, thousands over the price to actually get one today, and not waiting. And of course, you got the supply chain disruptions, inflations, and costs. A lot of those things. But within the cyclical, a lot of the models are changing. The business model of the consumer from manufacturer consumer is shifting too. And you go back to how Tesla created their model straight to consumer. I
Mhm.
see already a lot of companies are changing the ways they're going to get to the consumer, and they're changing the way they are made to order. They're going to improve the efficiency of production, so you can get a car quickly by even ordering it, getting what you want. But you can get maybe a 2, 3, or 4 week turnaround. Like I got my custom made color just like Tesla does, because the consumer now is driven by that, and there are not so many options. Of course, different luxury cars to standard cars are different, but that model also saves these companies money because there's too many different variables. People don't understand an ICE car, an industrial combustion engine car, there is a lot of components. Switching to meaning like a lot of mechanical components
Mhm.
to build one. When you're going to an EV car, they're built smart. There's much more intelligence to smart to build pieces to reduce the amount of have instead of having 1,000 pieces, you have a few hundred pieces. Reduces the amount of wear, process, the build time, turnaround, the chassis, the bolts, screws, everything is universal between different models. I think again, I got kind of what Tesla has proven this concept, and it works. The challenge is a lot of companies have to catch up of that forward thinking, because again, there's a lot of politics. So there's a lot of going back to the other things, a lot of jobs involved, a lot of these tradesmen and is people in this industry that build industries out of automotive, and it's a chain. So there are a lot of those cyclical, but the changes of the way we do business and produce, from logistics to producing innovation, is changing. And that people look at, they have to pull back a little bit. Hey, let's refocus. What is our go to market for the next 3 to 5 this decade? Just like you said, $1 trillion spend. What are we going to do to maximize profitability, efficiency, automation, and people to really make sure our company is future proof, can go through these cyclical, because we can't, a lot of companies can't sustain this up and down.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you started on the auto one, and I'll
Yeah.
put a little bit of data because I think we're in the midst of a change of how they go to market. But then let's think about what you touched on with how you produce and what it means to the factory and the employees and everything else. So running into COVID, the dealer network in the US was sitting on about 65 days worth of inventory
Okay.
of just finished vehicles sitting at your lots. In the first, call it end of last year, 1Q this year, I don't know the exact date, but somewhere in that window, that inventory bottomed out at like 24 days. Significant shifts, right? Where we sit in September is about 42 days. So inventory is almost actually doubled. But you mentioned when you drive by a dealer, it looks
Yeah.
pretty
Desolate.
skinny.
Yeah.
to, especially if you know, it's not like you buy a car every year, right? Like when you're in a car, it might have been pre-COVID and you just remember, hey, back then I go in the last Thursday of the month and I'm coming ready to deal and get a deal because, you know, this guy's got to get a car off the lot.
Yeah.
You know, so what does that mean from how they go to market? And it touches a lot on what you said with Tesla. That's proven, you know, if you buy a Tesla, it's like shopping almost on Amazon, right? You build it, you put your credit card in, you get it, you know, it's held and it's delivered when it's done. I really think that's how your traditional OEM, not to that level, but I can see an environment where 40 days is probably the restock level, right? There's certain models that are on the lot that you have the, oh no, I drove my car into a wall and I need a new one. It's a total with my insurance. I need it today. There's a certain lot, you know, there's a certain amount on the lot for that. There's probably a demo car, and you know what, let's, you know, a Ford Focus, an F-150, whatever, right? Whatever OEM. There's one of everything, and you can go out and test whatever you want. And then when you come through that OEM, you know, where the salesman would come down and you're haggling about price relative to the MSRP in the old days, I think it's going to look something along the lines of, you want car XYZ in silver with these bells and whistles. Well, if you want it delivered in the next 2 weeks, here's the 25 that I've got in inventory through the country, or coming in on a boat, or off the assembly line, or however it looks, right? And you might, as a consumer, unfortunately, you might not get the color you want. You might not get all the features. You might have to pay up for some. Or, you know, if you want that exact model, what does your lead time look like? Does it look like, you know, a month or whatever it is when we get into a more normalized environment? But I think that that's how auto is going to look in the sales. So then it goes to what you were mentioning from, you know, Detroit, and I grew up in Cleveland. So, you know, the old cliche in the Midwest, when Detroit caught a cold, the Midwest got the flu. You know, basically goes to exactly what you're saying with the industry behind it, of your suppliers, your EMS, and everything else. I think there's a couple of things that are going on. One that we've learned just from COVID, as autos emerge as a big market for electronics. One, the auto OEM showed they weren't very experienced in procuring components, right? So they are becoming more hands-on. And I think the net of that is they are going to look to their suppliers. They are going to be more involved. They're going to be more involved in the procurement. And they're also going to have to figure out, how do you automate? Because remember, that's been the early Tesla bottlenecks around production. A lot of it was Tesla was really trying to pioneer robots, and they were building their own robots when you go back a couple of years ago. So they've shown an ability to do that. And I think, to your point, I think the entire auto industry is going to have to catch up to some extent. On a side note, we do have, you know, thinking about different sales markets, for those traditional OEMs that have largely historically relied on an internal combustion engine. The last I've read, there's something like a $10 or $20 billion dealer level infrastructure needed to support charging, service. These aren't the same cars, which you touched on. So it's not driving in where the bread and butter of your transaction with a warranty and your loyalty is you're getting an oil change, because there's not a drop of oil in that car, right? It's computers, it's a high-tech service. So, you know, when I think of the opportunity for us as a country, you know, be a little big picture, maybe a little hopeful about the future for America. You know, we've got to really work and embrace job training around robotics, around engineering. And I think there's opportunities with that. It also scares me a little bit politically if we have the wherewithal to think through that. But we've got to retrain our workforce for what the new economy looks like.
I cannot agree. I mean, you hit a lot of valid points, and everything I echo of what you said. A lot of A lot of things are going to change, and we are in that inflection point. And I think 2023, my prediction, is the inflection point where a lot of things are going to change, a lot of things are reset. People have to really look out, are they have strategy, or have to refocus their strategy, because a lot of the technologies change. Again, a lot of the SaaS based software, the analytics, the insights, the dashboards, people are seeing things for the real time. And as you know, manufacturing in general is very traditional based. A lot of these
Mhm.
companies don't have all the fancy softwares. They're just build the OEM inventors. They gave it to a contract manufacturer. That guy just built to the spec. They use basic old, kind of ancient ERP systems. There aren't all the high SAPs and Oracles. They're running off of other. I mean, it's the 1% do that. There's the others who are normal, the mid size, and there's billions of dollars of spend on those mid size, and they don't have all the analytics. But now, how to repurpose procurement, supply chain, how do we get the parts on time, how the data insights now with APIs and all these things of real-time data, like the Amazon effect,
Mhm.
is now being transacted now down to the B2B into the manufacturing sector of how do we connect all these, how do we improve the efficiencies, how do we do this, and it's driving that through the to reinvent the technology. And today compute, as you know, to compute has got so cheap that
Yeah.
that compute, that microprocessor is so cheap and so powerful that you can build amazing solutions, technology, software solutions on top of it. That when we go, I can break into now of the SaaS space or the cloud systems, but that's really, I can see, in my opinion, what I've seen. I've been through this industry. I was born and raised in this industry. I can see that it's exciting. The future is bright, but we're in a inflection point of change.
I agree with you, Rob, 100%. And it, as you know, for some and for all of us, change is also, it's exciting, but it could also be scary,
Yeah,
right?
disruption.
And I think that's the thing to watch, because you touched on. I mean, I could pull my, this right here is more powerful than the computer that I had when I went to college
Yeah.
20 plus years ago. And it's what I used to call mom,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then when you think about workers in general, what amazes me, having young kids, I've got a 2-year old that knows how to swipe an iPad and hit whatever app to do the ABCs or the numbers
Navigate. Yeah.
or whatever, where I've got a mom who is still calling me to help her book a flight because she's afraid of putting her credit card in a website. So, when you think about that and go to market, and you've touched on, whether it's, even in the B2B, the Amazon effect extends well beyond the B2C consumer, right? And it's, we've got an entire generation of workers that their expectations of how you do business in general is different. So, regardless, I believe, and I've had a lot of these conversations with a number of people in the industry, you've got to kind of think about, how do you connect to your customers, whether it's on social media, whether it's on LinkedIn, whether it's on WhatsApp, WeChat. These are things that, I mean, they didn't exist 5 years ago or 10
Yeah.
years ago, right? And that's where business is being done. So it does extend, and it goes to your point on the inflection. It has been very, very rapid, and we could have a real serious
Yeah.
debate on it happened too quick, but
Yeah.
it is what it is in that point. And it's exciting, but the change isn't going to slow, and it's never slowed at any point. So you've kind of got to embrace it, and then hopefully figure out where to invest, and where to allocate resources around it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and that's for us. It's been, even as a leader in a company. I love to learn from people like yourselves, and data and information, just like people that have knowledge. But also, it's like, what do we take that knowledge, and how do we invest back into our companies for the future? Because we're investing not just in the people and the technology that can create IP. In these days, I think today it's about IP. Like, you have to build internal company businesses IP through the brand, through the processes. It's not all, the IP doesn't lay within the people as much as it used to, and
You
that
know,
that that's a change.
Without going into too many
Yeah,
details at Edgewater, our process, historically, our process is, and our IP is our people.
yeah,
In our semiconductor or hard tech team, as I mentioned, we've got 50 plus years collective experience across the five of us. That's our intellectual property. And when we think, and we have just some of these conceptually where we want our businesses to grow or to go, it is about some levels of automation even in our process. There's some things we just flat out with our process and how we do it, you can't automate it, but we've got to figure out a way to make the business more resilient and more enduring over time. And that involves not changing what our core is, what we're good at, but how do we enhance it? I heard you say that a couple of times,
yeah.
and where do we invest to do it?
And again, you're never going to get rid of people with automation, but there is just more advanced ways because a lot of succession is happening. A lot of the workforce and ingenuity is leaving the workforce. That the boomers, and you got are leaving, and that succession changes. And things are changing, and they leave with that. And of course, the new generation is not so, I would say, centric to come into some of these sectors of business sectors to take over, and it causes these gaps, right? And I think have you seen any of that? How about on your end? Have you seen any from the research? You seeing that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, for a bulk of my career, Rob, and
Yeah.
you know this, my bulk of my career was either spent doing research on the semiconductor or hard tech industry, or I worked in insurance. And
Yeah.
those are two marketplaces that I've seen some similarities between the two of them. And part of it is, how they go to market, where there's an intermediary between distribution. And then part of it is just, how they engage with customers. And it was this view that especially B2B has to be somewhat manual and heavy historical, right? And then what we're seeing, and I engage a lot with distribution, the rep community, the supplier, and you touched about, we've got a significant crop, especially of analog engineers
Yeah.
that are aging to retirement age, and there's a gap. So how do you transfer that knowledge, right? I look at big picture, the rep environment, which reminds me a lot of distribution or the agent broker relationship in insurance. Those businesses are a lot based on technical knowledge, whether it's engineering and rep or insurance knowledge in it, but it's also personal relationships inside of a territory. So those relationships have been built over decades. And so as you're bringing new people in, you've got the relationships, quote unquote, at the top, but those don't translate to the next generation of leaders. So, those are some of the conversations that we have when we're engaging. And by no means we're not an HR consulting firm, nor do we
Yeah.
claim that we've got the patent to figure that out. But those are some of the conversations and the questions when people in that distribution or that rep or that supplier, it's how do we deal with this intellectual property knowledge transfer to the next generation of leaders? What does that look like, and how do we do it? And I would argue, if you were in your 20s and you're an electrical engineer, it's probably a really exciting time, because there is a little bit of a barbell in terms of where that talent from paper gap is. Um, but then it's the leaders on this side of the barbell. How do they transfer that knowledge to the other? And that's where the art comes in over the science. And I think people are really working hard to figure out how to do.
I agree. I agree 100%. And as we wrap this up quickly, I said we could talk forever.
I
I'll wrap
know.
this up. My final question: to give a quick listeners, like, what's your outlook? I mean, we talked about the next year, but what's your outlook in Q4? We started it. What's your outlook right now into the component industry right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for the fourth quarter, we're, call it 5 days in, right? So I think I think the fourth quarter will be fine. So if I had to put a number on, quarter over quarter growth for 3Q, probably low single digit range, 3-4% quarter over quarter growth. And then I think we're going to be somewhere in that 2 to 3% quarter over quarter growth in 4Q. What's carrying that again is, as I mentioned earlier when we were talking, you've got delinquent backlogs that are supporting you through the end of the year, and you have capacity coming. So, I think this year ends okay. Absolutely, on a year over year basis, we've seen moderation, but I think we'll grow 15% this year. Next year, I think, that's when we run into that cyclicality, and we're base casing next year in the down, call it 7-8% year over year, in a somewhat normalized, stable state economy, which there's no guarantees of that. And then also in a stable state pricing environment, which is the thing looking into 23, I think that we're watching the closest, right? Price has been a huge tailwind for the industry, probably underappreciated. We're seeing some instances of certain suppliers that have been constrained who have seen, more competition based on their supply disruptions, re-engaging the marketplace. And we're watching that closely because I think that's the biggest risk if you call down 7 or 8 for next year base case. The risk of that being a down 15 or a down 20 is, A, does the economy really, really hit the skids, or B, do people really lean aggressively into price? But it doesn't change the structural growth. I still think it'll be $1 trillion business by the end of the decade.
I 100% agree. And we can't, in certain geopolitics, we can't control what's outside. We can't control the world stuff. So that can also have an effect. But this has been fantastic, Dennis. I really appreciate it. And I think we should start doing a quarterly one of these. This would be great to get quarterly updates from you.
You would love to, Rob. We'll definitely have to be in touch. It was great to be here, and thanks again for the invite.
Yeah, thank you for being a guest, and the insights and the listeners. Thank you guys all. I mean, again, this is Dennis Reed from Edgewater Research. He is the man with the data. He can really show you and give you the real picture what happened in the past, what's happening in the future, and hopefully can bring some good insights and business leaders and people to start thinking a little bit about a lot of things, what's changing in the world. So thanks again for coming on.
Excellent. Thanks, Rob. Thanks for having me.
And we're live.